Hello, my name's Matt Sergiou and I'm the proprietor of the websites Conspiro Media and also the Occult Beatles, and I'm here with you now to share a conversation I had with Andrew Arnett. Andrew's a musician, he's played in various bands, he's also worked as a cameraman, and he's a writer of many years' experience, a journalist who's written pieces that used to be centred on politics. However, in the last few years he's concentrated more on what he calls, and I quote, the paranormal agenda, and other such genres and topics connected to that theme, such as the Beatles, a band that he's a long-time fan of, and he came to my attention because of his research into the Beatles, into the occult, esoteric aspects of the Beatles, and more to the point, he came to my attention via an article, a rather unique article, I think, and that was published back in 2019 via the website paranoiamagazine.com. And it's unique, I think, because it ties in P.I.D, otherwise known as Paul is Dead, of course, with the Beatles and Aleister Crowley and also ancient Egypt. And intrigued by this article, which, as I say, came out in 2019, which marked the 50th anniversary of when the Paul is Dead conspiracy theory first came out into the mass consciousness, even though there'd been rumours and rumblings regarding Paul is Dead dating back some years before this. I went on the hunt to find out more about Andrew and his research into this particular subject. This was back in early 2021 or thereabouts when I did this, and I went on the hunt to find out more about Andrew and his Beatles research, and as a result I came across a couple of guest appearances of his with a couple of broadcasters, one of whom was Richard Surrett and the other one radio host Ed Opperman. And in these guest appearances of his, you can hear Andrew talk about the Beatles, Crowley, Paul is Dead, and also ancient Egypt, and in particular ancient Egyptian symbolism, and how ancient Egyptian symbolism ties into the Beatles and Paul is Dead, according to Andrew and his findings. And after reading this article of his and listening to these guest appearances, I thought to myself, do you know what? It might be a good idea for me to get in contact with Andrew, to ask him whether he'd be up for having a conversation with me about his research into the Beatles, P.I.D, Crowley and ancient Egyptian symbolism. And so that's what I did, and in January 2022 we hooked up via Zoom with me based in the UK and Andrew in the US, and we chatted and recorded it, and if you stick around from here on in, you can hear the results of that conversation that not only focused in on Andrew's research into all of this, but some of my findings as well, and which have, in the main, been published over the years on my site, the Occult Beatles. Amongst many, many other things during our conversation, we mention in passing the OTO, otherwise known as Ordo Templi Orientis, the secret order that Aleister Crowley belonged to. And we also talk about Robert Richard Hieronymus, PhD. Robert's an artist, researcher, author, and a veteran expert on occult symbology. For example, in 1969 he founded what's known as AUM, America's first state-approved school of esoteric studies, and in 1981 he received his PhD for his doctoral thesis titled, are you ready for this? Titled An Historic Analysis of the Reverse of the American Great Seal and its Relationship to the Ideology of Humanistic Psychology. Hieronymus's research about the Great Seal of the United States has been used in the speeches, literature and libraries of the White House, the US State Department and the Department of Interior, and he's also been a member of a number of secret societies. And back in 2002 he published a book titled Inside the Yellow Submarine, The Making of the Beatles Animated Classic. It's a book that not only gives us an insider's view into the making of the Beatles animated film that was released in 1968, but it also features an occult analysis of the film according to Hieronymus, who compares it to various aspects within ancient Egyptian symbology, such as the ancient Egyptian god Khepra. As you may know, Khepra was a god with the body of a human and the head of an insect. A beetle, Back in 2012, I published an article on this, and I interviewed Hieronymus too, an interview that you can find via my page ConspiroTV and also at the Occult Beatles. In his analysis, Hieronymus puts forward the idea that the Beatles may possibly have been inspired, whether consciously or unconsciously, to name themselves the Beatles, as perhaps a tribute to, in a sign of respect to, ancient Egyptian occult symbology. During my conversation with Andrew, and inspired by Hieronymus's ideas, we both discuss the officially sanctioned origins of where the band name The Beatles came from. For example, John Lennon, back in the early 1960s, before the Beatles achieved worldwide fame, and as you may know, he stated in what one might describe as typical Lennon-esque surrealist fashion, he stated in an article in a Liverpool-based music magazine that the band name The Beatles came to him in a vision where he saw a man on a flaming pie. With regards to my conversation with Andrew, and which I'm about to play out to you in a few seconds, I think one of the most prominent overarching themes that flows through my conversation with Andrew about the Beatles and ancient Egyptian symbology and Crowley and P.I.D. is not only of death but also of rebirth. So, as you'll hear Andrew mention during my chat with him, he puts forward the idea that P.I.D. alludes to, in his words, spiritual regeneration. So, yeah, in other words, Paul McCartney didn't die as such. It was a rebirth. And this was certainly on Andrew's radar when I hooked up with him in January of 2022 for our conversation via Zoom, and this was just a week or so after Christmas. And as a result, and I dare say inspired by the Christmas holidays, he informed me that he had some new info to share with me, info that he suggests not only might link P.I.D. to this idea of death and rebirth, but also, and as you'll hear Andrew say now, into the theme of Christmas.
Let me touch upon that, because what I was doing was reading up on Christmas in general. And I've explored the concept of Christmas and Santa Claus in previous articles for different things, different publications. But I was just interested in the symbolism of it. And I got to what it is that, there was I got to reading about, well, let's see, it's Father Christmas. Well, there's a connection I found between Father Christmas, the ghost of Christmas Present, as it's portrayed in the Christmas Carol story by Dickens, that and the Green Man of British folklore, and also the Arthurian tale of the Green Knight. So how does that connect with Paul is Dead?
Right.
Exactly. In brief, we know the story of, the Grinch. He's a nasty old bugger and he's trying to steal Christmas. It essentially is the situation. The running theme there is he is green. He's a green-skinned creature. Now that ties in, I was wondering about that. That ties in with the Green Man concept of folklore, which seems to be associated with a sort of a vegetative spirit or a sort of a rebirth concept.
Yeah.
But really the essence is in the Green Knight tale. And basically, in short, the Green Knight is it's actually a Christmas tale, and it takes place, I think the first one was written in Gawain and the Green Knight back in the 1400s. And basically on Christmas, the Green Knight shows up at King Arthur's round table, and he's not there to start a war, but he's there to offer a Christmas challenge, as it were, to the knights. And basically the challenge was any one of you knights could take a swing at me with an axe, and then the following year shall return, and I'll do the same to you. One blow with the axe. And so Arthur, of course, jumped to the challenge and said, I'll do it. But Gawain, one of the, the most courageous of the knights, stepped in and said, I will do that instead. So Gawain went ahead and he took his axe and he took a swing at the Green Knight, and the knight's head fell off. And then the knight picked up the head, replaced it onto his body, and said, great, terrific. I'll be back next year to do the same to you. To make a long story short, so the next year comes, Gawain goes ahead with his commitment. He goes to, now on his way, he goes and he spends some time in a castle. And this castle is, I think it's hosted by, I forget the name of the Lord there, but while there, he's presented with a certain amount of tests, as it were, like his wife tried to seduce him, different sort of chivalry tests. But anyway, so the New Year's Day comes, Gawain goes to the chapel. It's the Green Chapel, the meeting place for the fateful encounter. He lays his head down on the chapel, or he exposes his neck. The Green Knight takes out his axe. He feints 2 blows, and then on the third one, he just kind of nicks him just a bit and said, that's it. You passed the test or whatnot. And he also revealed himself to be the lord of the castle in which he just spent some time at. So he was actually, so the Green Knight actually presented he was in disguise in effect. He had a double. He was the lord of the castle that hosted Sir Gawain on his journey there to the meeting place, and he was also the Green Knight. So a couple of bells started clicking in my head regarding this. And the first thing was that the Green Knight, of course, was decapitated. Now, that rings a bell with me regarding Paul is dead, because in the story, as we understand it, the Paul is dead myth, which began in the summer of 1969, and I'll just sort of recount a bit of it just to update us. The original rumor, as it were, that circulated at that time around college campuses and radio stations was that Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash on the M1 motorway on September 11th, 1966, and then was secretly replaced by a look-alike double to keep, the theory was to keep the money rolling in for the band and the country. The band, however, like Lennon, especially Lennon, felt obliged to leave hints attesting to the fact that there was a double that replaced him, that way to appease his guilty conscience. So that's sort of the general Paul is dead myth or conspiracy theory. And one other aspect is it involved McCartney's head, which was mutilated and, in fact, according to the rumor, decapitated. So for me, the concept sort of started clicking. Here's a mythological tale indigenous to Britain. The Green Knight, his head is decapitated, as well he's actually has a double, which is quite unusual. And why would that be in there? And really, at the end of the day, it gets back to the concept, the overarching theme of why I think the Paul is dead like myth is out there. There is one more thing though, and this is actually really what connects it to the Paul is dead thing. My my contention, just to put it out there, is that Paul McCartney is not in fact dead, and what we're seeing is not in fact a double that replaced him. But what it is, but the conspiracy theory is real, and the myth is real, and it was actively propagated by the Beatles and their people to put out a message. And there are probably different levels of it, but I believe the meaning has to do with sort of a mythological initiation thing that relates to, probably Masonic aspects, but certainly to Egyptian mythology. And one more thought on the Green Knight and how it connects to the Paul is dead thing regards. I was digging a little deeper on that matter. And it turns out that the Green Knight, some of these, like the Father Christmas, by the way, Father Christmas and the Ghost of Christmas Present is, specifically the Ghost of Christmas Present, when he encounters Scrooge in that Dickens tale and shows him what's going on and all this business. He's dressed like Santa Claus, or a king, as it were, a real big guy, a giant. And he's dressed, but he's not dressed in a red robe, rather he's dressed in a green robe. But at the end of the day, there's a connection between the Green Knight, Father Christmas, that character, and the deity of Nordic lore of Odin. And the god Odin, and the father of Thor. And if you take that and you go deeper with that, it gets to the heart of what we're talking about. And that it regards the Egyptian initiation ceremonies. And that everything has to do with Osiris, the god of the dead, the god of the underworld, of the Egyptians. And it just turns out that Osiris's skin is depicted as being green.
Well, check this out. I don't know if you're aware of this. You talk there about perhaps the Beatles being part of Paul is Dead, as in they orchestrated this quote unquote conspiracy theory. Are you aware of this claim? It was put forward, actually, credit where credit is due, to a writer who goes under the name of Redwell Trabant. And Redwell Trabant runs a site called The Beatles Conspiracy. Redwell Trabant did a little bit of detective work into I Am a Phony and The Winged Beetle, the videos that have been put out there over the last few years, which tap into the Paul is Dead mythos and look at certain aspects of that, and bring in Crowley, of course, into this. Rotten Apple is another name that's used to Rotten Apple, I Am a Phony, and The Winged Beetle are the three names that are used by this video maker to bring out these YouTube films. So yeah, Redwell Trabant did a little bit of detective work into I Am a Phony, Rotten Apple, whatever you want to call them. And apparently it would appear that through a little bit of detective work, he discovered a company which makes films, which makes videos, and it is linked. He found links. I haven't got the information here in front of me to be able to give you the exact details, but Redwell Trabant was able to find through company records in the UK links between I Am a Phony, the company that put together I Am a Phony, Rotten Apple, the Winged Beetle films, to none other than Neil Aspinall, who was a former roadie of the Beatles. Actually, he comes from Liverpool. He came from Liverpool. He was a friend of the Beatles in their pre-fame days. And then in later years, he became their roadie. And then when the Beatles stopped touring, he worked at Apple, their company. And then in the 1970s, I think it was from the 1970s onwards, he effectively became the director of Apple. So he was basically the Beatles business manager in a sense. And he was in that position up until the 2000s or 2010s or thereabouts. He passed away a few short years ago. So he was very much in the inner circle. He was one of the trusted few that actually roots back to Liverpool, back to the Beatles' early days. But yeah, Redwell Trabant actually found links linking the Rotten Apple, the Winged Beetle, I Am a Phony, these videos, these P.I.D. videos, to none other than Neil Aspinall, which I don't know if you were aware of that, but I don't know what you think about that. But yeah.
Well, I've seen those I Am a Phony videos, the Winged Beetle, and the Rotten Apple. Whenever I come across those videos, I'm pretty much astounded because they're just so mysterious and they're so well put. It seems to me well put together, and it certainly isn't like, it doesn't go out of its way. It doesn't make specific claims, but so many suggestions. And it's eerie. I mean, I have to say, I often wonder, who the hell is this? And the source material is amazing. And now you're putting a name to it. And so it wouldn't surprise me because of the info. I mean, I guess I heard it and must have been some kind of, insider thing, but that's a big name, Neil Aspinall. I mean, he would,
he was in the inner circle. There's no doubt about that. He was one of the trusted few.
Yeah, his name always comes, as you said, like, big part of, running the whole thing going back into the 60s. So there you go.
Okay, let's get into the Egyptology side of this regarding the Beatles and Crowley. I'm suspecting has got a lot, features a lot in this with regards to what you've seen in your work and discovered in your work. So yeah, if you want to get into that, would you want to get into that? Tell us a little bit about Egyptology and how that ties into the Beatles and perhaps Crowley.
Yeah, obviously Crowley being an Egyptologist in many ways, and in the mystery schools here he is involved in and have propagated, and mystery schools in general, sort of, referring back to that, and it turns out that, in fact, all of our religions can, in a way, really kind of stems back to Egypt, just generally speaking. As we, our Christianity, which is our dominant religion, for the most part, its founder, Jesus, as we know, is a Jewish descendant. And if you look at Judaism came out of Egypt, because Moses, it turns out, was the brother, whether it was by adoption or whatnot, was the brother of a pharaoh. I mean, he grew up in the, as a pharaoh. So then he broke away and then he led the Jews out of Egypt. But the Egyptian influence is felt through all of those religions, through Christianity, in fact. So if, every time, whether it's a Christian priest or a Christian in general, or a Jewish person for that matter, ends a prayer, it ends in the word amen, which is, what is it really but a reference to Amun-Ra, the sun god. And so if you look at it from that viewpoint, you have to wonder, like, what really was Ra, the sun god, and what were the Egyptians worshiping, and in turn, what exactly, what is the meaning, the hidden meaning behind Christianity, Judaism, and all that stuff. But I think one way to look at it is through astrotheology, which I guess is becoming a little more popular these days, but it's a way to look at deities in terms of our planets and stars, and like these gods sort of like represent them in a way. Really, I think there's a few ways to jump into this.
It's a big subject, isn't it? I've looked into this and I've written articles about it on my website, the Occult Beatles. It's huge, man. Where do you jump in? You've got this massive swimming pool. Which part of the swimming pool do you jump into first? It's huge. It is huge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the one person that really, sort of made the direct link, and you have a great article on it on Occult Beatles, and that's the book and the researcher, the writer Hieronymus, that did that great breakdown of the symbolism of the Yellow Submarine.
The film, the
film and the album, and I think that says he did really uncovered a lot. So I think I haven't looked at that recently, but in essence, the bottom line there is that the Yellow Submarine represents, I guess it's the boat of the sun. Yeah, I mean it's
because it's colored yellow as well, so it has the sun, the color of the sun. So it's kind of like this vessel, and in the film, in the actual animated film Yellow Submarine, you see the Yellow Submarine flying through the sky at points. So it's like this yellow thing, if you like, that's in the sky. So it has that kind of sun symbolism to it, doesn't it? Yeah,
well, exactly. And it would be actually in Egypt, it would be referenced as the boat of the sun. Now, this is a vehicle for specifically a deity, a very significant Egyptian deity named Khepra. And it turns out he's the beetle-headed aspect of Ra, the sun god. He's got a beetle's head. So this is a very intriguing concept. So, obviously the naming of the Beatles, they're named the Beatles. And the naming of the Beatles is another story. It's a little ambiguous because Lennon gives a couple of stories. First, he says that, that he and Stuart Sutcliffe wanted to sort of mimic Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They're insects, and then the beat part is it's kind of like Beatles, but with the A, so it's like a beat, like a rhythm. So that's kind of cool. That's neat.
Yeah.
And he also said on another occasion, he said, it came to me in a vision, a dream, and a man on a flaming pie came flying out of the sky and said to me, you will be called Beatles with an A. So that, and that's sort of like, hey, that's interesting, because when Crowley was teaching and espousing his occult philosophy, he would say, this is magic with a K, distinguishing it from other forms of magic. So a little bit of a reference there,
So John is saying, hey, it's Beatles, but with an A. So it's like magic with a K, Beatles with an A. It's that kind of, it's even the way it rhymes, it's got the same kind of flow to it, hasn't it?
It's got a poetic, lyrical touch to it.
Yeah.
But the Beatles specifically, it's interesting if you're looking at it in with Kepra as a beetle-headed god. You know, what it is with this guy, well, this deity, Kepra, is important because he's associated with death, rebirth, and really the Kepra relates to the beetle, a specific kind of beetle, which is the dung beetle, which is known to roll up, you know, like whatever, cattle manure or whatnot, and it rolls it in a ball, surprisingly in a direction, in an east to westward direction. So this is observed by the Egyptian philosophers or whatnot. And they said, you know, this is significant, symbolic of the sun in a sense, the direction, the ball, what have you. And they saw a connection there. And also the dung being a dead matter, a dead sort of, you know, waste being used. The reason they do this is because then they put their hatchlings in there, and those beetles in turn feed off the dung until maturity. So it's like a birth, death, rebirth thing, and a recycling. So in a sense, it, you know, it relates to the sun. But this whole Paul is dead thing, in essence, to me, has to do with this initiation rite, mythological initiation of birth, death, and rebirth. And once we look at it from that viewpoint, and specifically the Egyptian viewpoint, we can start breaking down all the symbolism in a very startling, and it all falls neatly into place. So these are some of the things I want to re-look at some of these traditional like album covers and these clues, Paul is Dead clues, and then look at it in a deeper level. And so, yeah, those are some things I want to touch on.
Yeah, I mean, the Beatles, spelt Beatles. The Beatles in their pre-fame days, I think it was the early 60s or late 50s, sometime around that time when they were still in Liverpool, when they were struggling to get gigs, to get live dates, when they were looking for stardom, as it were. They were actually called for a time the Silver Beatles, with Beatles as in insect, Beetles. So they did actually use that name for a short spell before they changed it to the Beatles, as in beat music. Also, Paul has mentioned this. Yes, because it's got a double entendre. It can be seen as Beatles as an insect. John and Paul and George Harrison were huge fans of Buddy Holly when they were younger. But as you say, at the same time, if you put in the spelling beat, B-E-A-T, as in beat music, then it brings in this double meaning. But yeah, it's all a bit airy-fairy, really. It's all a bit hazy, because George Harrison, in the Beatles official documentary, The Anthology, he actually says, his offering towards the origins as to where the name Beatles came from, actually says it's debatable. You know, he doesn't know where this name, the Beatles, came from. Yes, it could have come from John Lennon and his then art student friend in Liverpool, Stuart Sutcliffe, who joined the band, who was one of the earliest members. It could have come from them and this messing around with the word Beatles. But he's also put forward the possibility, although this doesn't look as believable to me as the other possibilities, he's put forward the possibility that it could have come from the movie The Wild One, which starred Marlon Brando. It came out in 1953 in the US, and I've never actually seen the film myself, but apparently it follows the exploits of an American motorcycle gang by the name of the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, BRMC, and Brando plays Johnny Strabler in it. He's a gang leader, and there's a gang in it that are called the Beatles, spelt in the insect form. And yeah, there's a line in the film where one of the stars of the film, which is who's Lee Marvin, I think he's one of the gang members, he actually says in the film, and I quote, "Johnny, we've been looking for you. The Beatles have missed you. All the Beatles have missed you." So you've got Beatles and Johnny as well. So, but the problem with that idea that George Harrison put forward there, that it possibly came from that, is that the film didn't come out in the UK till 1967. For some reason, I think there was some kind of censorship issues. So it didn't actually come out in the UK till 1967. So there's no way that the Beatles could have seen this, because with the exception of George, who I think had a sister who lived in the US, and I think he came over to the US, George came over and visited the US once prior to the Beatles coming over in 1964 when they did to conduct their first US tour there. I think he visited briefly prior to that. The Beatles never went to the US, so there's no way they could have seen this film prior to that. It's, you know, this is, of course, the days before video, DVD, streaming, and all the rest of it. They would not have been privy. These young lads from Liverpool wouldn't have been privy to be able to see the film, to be able to get that inspiration in order to name it after that film. So I think we can perhaps toss that possibility aside. I just want to add one more little thing here to add credence to this Beatles insect idea, that the Beatles actually perhaps were thinking of the insect more than we're led to believe by official accounts, is that up to about 1963, February, March time 1963, if you look at some of the logos that the Beatles were using on the drum kit, on the front of the drum kit, they had a logo for their band name, The Beatles. One of the earliest logos, which they later ditched, was actually, if you look at the letter B, it's actually formed in the shape of a beetle. So it's actually, even though the name of the band is spelt The Beatles with a Beatles, if you look at the letter B, it's got two little horns on the top to depict Beatles. And there's a book that came out earlier in 2021 called The Lyrics, and it's Paul McCartney's part memoirs, part lyrics, looking at some of his lyrics from past decades. So it's part memoirs and part lyrics book. And in that, he's got scans and photos of remnants from his past, if you like, little bits and pieces. For example, there is a diary entry from 1961, which I'm assuming, seeing as that it's in this book from Paul McCartney, that I'm assuming is from Paul McCartney's diaries from 1961. So this would be pre-fame Beatles. And in that, there's, as I say, there's a page from his diary that we can see a scan of it. And it's Paul McCartney. I'm assuming it's McCartney. There are sketches in this diary, biro sketches of him messing around with possible ideas for a Beatles logo. And in each of those ideas that he scrolls down, he scribbles down with the biro, we have representations of the insect, the Beatles as an insect.
You know, I think I remember seeing that Beatles logo on Ringo's drum set with the Beatles.
Very early, yeah, it's very early 1963.
I think,
yeah, it was designed by a guy by the name of Tex O'Hara.
But
that doesn't necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he was the guy that devised the sketch. He might have been ordered or instructed to put that sketch together. But looking at the lyrics, this book by McCartney, in which he's got scans and pictures of various memories from his past, as I say, there is a scan of his diary in that book in which he himself, McCartney, is sketching out the ideas for this Beatles logo with the insect as the central idea behind the design for the logo. So it's McCartney that's doing this. Whether it was his idea or maybe someone else suggested it to him, so he began to sit down with a sketch in his head and work on what somebody else suggested to him, or whether it was his idea initially, I don't know. But certainly we have evidence now to show that the Beatles as an insect was perhaps more important to them than we're being led to believe, you know. Yeah.
I think that it's you get into this sort of realm, as it were. This they're touching on magic, they're touching on mysticism. I think they're very involved in that. And then you have these things, these connections, and some of them are deliberate, and then some of them might be examples of synchronicity. Some kind of mystical connection.
Yeah, I mean, Lennon, certainly was very interested in ancient Egyptian history, and Yoko Ono and John actually collected ancient Egyptian artifacts. I've got a quote here that I've typed out in front of me here, where she said in an interview in 1980, shortly before John Lennon's death, she said in an interview, "To make money, you have to spend money. But if you are going to make money, you have to make it with love." And she then goes on, "I love Egyptian art. I make sure to get all the Egyptian things, not for their value, but for their magic power. Each piece has a certain magic power." And certainly John and Yoko in the late 70s sometime did go to Egypt and visit the pyramids and all the ancient sites. I've got a quote here again in front of me from the book Lennon in America, 1971 to 1980. This is based in part on the so-called Lost Lennon Diaries, and this is by author Jeffrey Giuliano. And in it, Giuliano writes that the Lennons had begun to, and I quote, "seriously invest in ancient Egyptian artifacts." And to quote from the book, he writes, "Relics they bought included a skull, an infant's breastplate, and a 7-foot lion statue." A 7-foot lion statue. This is serious collecting. And again, to quote from another book, which I've copied out here in front of me, in the book John Lennon, A Biography, the author of the book, Jacqueline Edmondson, claims that John, and again I quote, "believed he had lived in Egypt in a previous life." So certainly in John Lennon's case, we can see some affinity there, some love, some respect, some deep respect. They're putting their hands in their pockets, aren't they? Some serious respect there for ancient Egypt. Certainly McCartney as well, with the Egypt Station album, which came out a few years back. The cover, if you've seen the cover of his solo album, Egypt Station, it's absolutely festooned with Egyptian symbology, isn't it? And if I'm not mistaken, the actual cover is actually a painting or a picture that he himself drew back in the late 1980s, early 90s, late 1980s, sometime around then. So that's actually the cover of Egypt Station with all this Egyptian symbology is actually a painting or a drawing that Paul put together himself. This is his creation from the late 80s, early 90s, which he turned into Egypt Station. And he claims that he got the ideas for that cover from an ancient from a reference book on ancient Egypt. So that's what he claims. But you've looked into that as well, haven't you? You've looked into the Egypt Station album.
Yeah, I looked. I did look into that. That was a while back. There's so much, these guys were reading Lennon, and then they were reading really deep into this Egyptian stuff. There's there's a quote from the Egyptian Book of the Dead I have here. It says, "And behold, thou shalt make a scarab," or a beetle, as the other name for a beetle is scarab, "make a scarab of green stone, which shall be placed in the heart of a man, and it shall perform for him the opening of the mouth." And basically, the heart, this stone beetle, 3 inches long, was placed in the heart cavity, which was removed from the body. And then this is part of the process of the mummification of these Egyptian pharaohs. And basically, it's a funeral, right? And again, it's sort of like it comes back to the birth and death, birth, and rebirth cycle, which seems to play out in the Beatles motif. The beetle also is, like in all kingdoms, there's there's the top of the food chain, as it were. And the lion, like in the animal kingdom, the lion is sort of symbolic of that. And the lion is also associated with the sun, like Leo, with the mane, the golden colors, and all that bit. In the mineral world, of course, we have gold as being the sort of gold standard, as it were, of minerals that also reflects the sun. But in the insect kingdom, the beetle is considered the top of the list. And so, there's a synchronicity there because, aside from these other things, connections, the Beatles are also really kind of understood as the biggest band in rock and roll history, in pop culture, and so there's a certain link there that's interesting.
Yeah. Again, I mean, looking at this scenario where the Beatles, the members within the Beatles, are perhaps trying to play down. Maybe I'm just putting this out there. I'm not saying this is what happened, but as I said earlier, that the Beatles were perhaps playing down the links of the band name The Beatles to the insect, the beetle, and especially as it connects to ancient Egypt. Again, just to add to that, what did Paul McCartney do when he left the Beatles? He went and formed this band Wings. Now his story as to how the name the band Wings came to be was, off the top of my head, I think it was, I might be getting this wrong, but I think one of his daughters had been born around that time, 1970, 71. And he says he saw the wings of an angel in a vision. And he thought, hey, that's a great name for a band. Okay, all right. But what do we see in ancient Egyptian symbology? We see a winged beetle. So here we have a band called Wings, which has been started by a beetle. So we have a beetle now with wings, a winged beetle. And of course, this takes us into Aleister Crowley territory again, because we have the beetle with wings, the winged beetle, the book, The Winged Beetle. But do you know what I mean? It's like, whether they're doing it deliberately or subconsciously, they keep tapping into this insect, this beetle insect symbology, don't they?
See, Crowley in 1910 published a book of poetry, occult themed poetry, called The Winged Beetle. It has titles in it like The Octopus, The Two Secrets, The Wings, The Wizard Way. One poem is called The Wings. And it just looks as if, researchers and theorists have made a connection like that, like that's the next step, right? Beatles, Wings, brings us back to Crowley, brings us back to Egypt.
I'm no great expert on Crowley. I'm not going to pretend that I am, but in preparation for our chat, I looked a little bit into Crowley and some links between the beetle, the sacred image of the beetle, and ancient Egypt. And I came across a quote from a book which is titled Confessions. And there was a piece in this. I don't know how significant this is. I'll throw this to you and see what you think. There's a part in the book where he's quoted as describing, what happened whilst he was staying at his home in Scotland, the infamous Boleskine house, which, of course, in much later years, was bought by Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, who was, of course, kind of like a disciple of Crowley's. Now, in the book, apparently there was a point where Crowley was involved in this kind of rivalry with this particular individual by the name of Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Now, with regards to this toing and froing this feud, if you like. There's a quote in the book. I'm gonna read it to you with regards to this. Crowley, it was Crowley had resumed magical work in a desultory way on finding that Mathers was attacking him, and Mathers, through his magical work, had succeeded in killing most of Crowley's dogs. At this time, Crowley kept a pack of bloodhounds and that were used to go hunting. Now, the servants in the house too were constantly being made ill, one way or another. And so therefore, what Crowley did was he employs the appropriate talismans from the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin against Mathers, evoking Beelzebub and his 49 servitors. And to quote from the book, word for word, Crowley states, "One day, to my amazement, having gone into the bathroom to bathe, I discovered a beetle. As I have said, I take no interest in natural history and know nothing of it. But this beetle attracted my attention at once. I had never seen anything like it before. It was about 1.5 inches long and had a single horn nearly as long as itself. The horn ended in a small spear suggestive of an eye. From the moment, for about a fortnight, there was an absolute plague of these beetles. They were not merely in the house, they were on the rocks outside in the gardens, by the sacred spring, everywhere. But I never saw one outside my house, outside the estate. I sent a specimen to London by the experts who were unable to identify this particular species." So I don't know what you make of that. Crowley and the Beatles.
That's again, that sounds like an example of synchronicity, which was coined by Jung.
Yeah.
And I think I'm gonna have to look this up. This is definitely something. I think he has a famous case where he's sort of treating a patient, and she has a remarkable beetle vision or experience encounter as well. But yeah, well, that's a whole other thing. Yeah, Boleskine, Jimmy Page. It's an example of how deep this Crowleyan thing runs through the rock community. I mean, I was just revisiting. I was revisiting the film Lucifer Rising by Kenneth Grant. No, not Kenneth Grant.
Kenneth Anger.
Kenneth Anger. A whole, Crowleyan sort of initiation rite film that was slated to star Mick Jagger as Lucifer. Yes, Jimmy Page was slated to, do the soundtrack. And then Page pulled out. But yeah, I mean, Kenneth Grant, he got...
Kenneth Anger.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Kenneth Anger. I guess he referenced the fact that, when you start getting into this sort of thing, you're opening up a Pandora's box. You're like unleashing, whether it's demonic entities or perhaps, unconscious sort of, if you're looking at from a Jungian viewpoint, unconscious powers, whatever the case is, these things come to fore. And then you saw a lot of that weird stuff happening at Boleskine, dogs dying, weird manifestations of insects and whatnot. There's a lot of that going on. But again, I think, it comes back to the whole Egyptian concept. But yeah, that's wild. The name, the Beatles, that's a mystery right there.
Yeah, Kenneth Anger was an occult filmmaker, a director who was a disciple, no less, of Crowley's, of Aleister Crowley. You mentioned we're talking about Kenneth Anger there,
yeah.
And you slipped in the name Kenneth Grant,
Yeah.
and I think I know why you did that, because there is actually a guy by the name of Kenneth Grant who, along with his wife Steffi,
Yeah.
are occultists. Were occultists, and certainly I know why you were saying that, why you were slipping that name out by mistake. It's in your head, isn't it? Because this kind of those names do actually link into the Beatles. I don't know if we want to mention that now, or perhaps there is another little piece about ancient Egypt and Paul McCartney that I'd like to mention to you. I don't know if you want to hear about this. You might and see what your take is on this.
I'd love to. Anything you've got, I'm all ears.
Okay, all right
all
then.
Ears.
This is something that was actually I looked into in an article on my website, the Occult Beatles, some time back, and this was an article where I was basically looking at the links, as we've been discussing today, looking at the links between the Beatles and ancient Egypt, and McCartney and ancient Egypt, and all of that. Now, when the Beatles broke up, there was the McCartney album was the first post-Beatles solo album by McCartney that came out in 1970, and that was followed in 71 by the album Ram, which was his second post-Beatles album, solo album. Now, there has been some discussion within the alternative media, if you like, as to why he titled this album Ram. If you recall, the cover of the album has got McCartney on the front of it. I think it's taken from a photograph which was taken on his farm in Scotland. And basically, it's him standing behind a ram with his hands on the ram's horns. It's like he's kind of pulling the horn, pulling the ram backwards, or trying to control the ram from moving too fast ahead. I don't know what's going on there, but he's certainly got his hands on the ram's horns. It has been said that, as I say, within the alternative media, by various commentators that look at this kind of stuff, that this perhaps is some kind of satanic, there is some kind of satanic symbology going on here. And I guess that's got to do with the fact that these are horns on the ram, so it's the devil's horns. Or of course, you could liken this to the half human, half animal deity, the so-called satanic deity Baphomet, which is a horned deity, which, as I say, has got the head of a goat with the horns, and of course the human body. Okay, perhaps I'm not disputing that, and I'm not supporting it either. I'm open to that. But here's another possibility, okay? And this is something that I looked at on my website, the Occult Beatles, in this particular article that I mentioned. About 5 or 6 years after the release of Ram came another version of Ram, an instrumental orchestral version of Ram. It was released. It was for many decades, up until about the late 80s, early 90s. McCartney didn't put his name to this album. He didn't credit himself with having created the album, although it was him that was actually behind it. For about 30 odd years, no one actually could say this for sure. Of course, some people in the music industry and music fans guessed that it was perhaps him, but he didn't actually put his name on the actual record as to him being the creator of this instrumental version of Ram. Instead, he gave the credit to a created character by the name of Percy Thrills Thrillington. You can see the pictures for yourself. There were pictures created for the media to publicize the album. It was actually a half human figure with a goat's head, more to the point, with a ram's head. So here again, we have, people who are looking at this would say, aha, look, it's Baphomet, because it's half human and all of that, with the goat's head, with the ram's head, with the horns and everything. Okay, but just suspend that thought for a moment, that perhaps it's a quote unquote satanic image alluding to Baphomet. The actual person who put together the orchestration for the album was a guy by the name of Richard Hewson. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Richard Hewson was actually the arranger, the musical arranger for the Beatles album Let It Be, their 1970 album, which was the last album that they released as a band. Now, in more recent times, he's been in interviews, and he's actually expressed some kind of like confusion as to why McCartney decided to put together this fictional character, this Percy Thrillington character, and to give the credit for this instrumental album to Percy Thrillington. And the confusion for Richard comes from the fact that he can't understand why McCartney would do that. His way of thinking is, surely it would have been better for McCartney to have released the album under the name of Paul McCartney. Hence, it would have sold perhaps millions of copies, because as it stands, it didn't actually sell that many copies when it came out in the 1970s. And Richard Houston's way of thinking is, well, that's like commercial suicide. Surely he should have released it under his own name. So why did he create this character, this half man, half ram figure, in order to do this? Wouldn't it have been better to just release it under his own name, Paul McCartney, and sell more copies? So he's a little bit confused, even to this day, as to why this happened. Well, perhaps, again, what McCartney was doing was rooting back to ancient Egypt. I don't know. I'll throw this to you and see what you think, because apparently, same as Khepra, the beetle-headed god with the human form and the head of a beetle, there was actually a ram-headed ancient Egyptian figure, human body with the head of a ram, by the name of Khnum. And from what I understand, Khnum is the creator of human beings, the bringer of life. And he's also been described as the maker of the cosmic egg, as it's described. Now, when I was putting together this article that I mentioned on my site, The Occult Beatles, looking into all of this, the connections between the Beatles and McCartney and ancient Egypt, there's a book that I quote in my article. It's called The Egyptian Hieroglyph Metaphysical Language, and it's by Egyptologist and author Mustafa Gadala. And in this book, we get a direct connection shared between Khnum, this cosmic egg, as well as the beetle, which was, as we've said already, this very, very sacred symbol in ancient Egypt. And that's because, as you said earlier, because scarab beetles roll large balls of dung to lay their eggs in, and that eventually hatch with their young from there. That's a behavior that ancient Egyptians saw, as we mentioned earlier, that's seen as an act of self-creation, of creation, hence the scarab beetle's association with the life-living sun god Khepra, who was said to be self-created, born of his own substance. Now, in his book, Mustafa Gadala, and I quote, this is what he notes, and I quote, "To signify birth, or the world, or man, they, the Egyptians, draw a scarab. It takes some cow dung and makes a round ball of it, very much in the shape of the world, rolling it with its hind legs from east to west. It faces the east so as to give it the shape of the world, for the world is born from the east to the west. The universal bubble is egg-shaped, and therefore the universal bubble is also called the cosmic egg. Egyptian texts refer to Khnum as the one who made the cosmic egg. Khnum represents the cosmic egg and all creation within it, as affirmed by references to his attributes in the Egyptian text as being the modeler, governor of the house of life, being the cosmic egg, maker of heaven and earth and the water and mountains, the maker of things that are, creator of things that shall be. The cosmic egg has same definitions as the ram-headed Khnum. Khnum is therefore almost always depicted next to or within the cosmic egg. Now, Khnum is, from my understanding, strongly associated with ancient Egyptian solar symbolism as well. According to one account I've read, he's described as being soul of the sun god Ra. And Khepra is allied with this sun god too, of course. And so, yeah, Khepra represented the rising or the morning sun. He was the Egyptian god of rebirth. And again, to quote from another book here, from The Secret Teaching of All Ages, by Manly P. Hall, who was a 33rd degree Mason, a mystic, a scholar, an author. He states, Ra, the god of the sun, as the creator of the universe, he was symbolized by the head of a scarab and was called Kepra, which signified the resurrection of the soul and a new life at the end of the mortal span. The scarab was the emissary of the sun. Chnum is set to represent the nocturnal manifestation of the sun before it rises again the next day with Kepra. So yeah, so I don't know what you think about that. Incidentally, let me just finish here by just noting that in later years, in the 1980s, Richard Hewson had a hit in the charts. I think it was about 1985 with Clouds Across the Moon, I think it was called. I think it came out in 85 or 84, sometime around there. It was a hit in the charts. Certainly in the UK it was. It was top 10. Can you guess what the name of this band was? The Ra Band. R-A-H. Now, according to Hewson, the reason that he chose the Ra Band is it's an initial for R-A-H, as in his name, Richard Anthony Hewson. But yeah, you never know with these things, do you? So yeah, I don't know what you think about that. The ram-headed god, Hnum, and Ram.
I was trying to think of. I came across that when I was thinking about McCartney, and maybe that's the meaning that I was looking for, because I wasn't sure how to associate him with the ram. Of course, McCartney is associated with the walrus. He's associated with and maybe this answers that mystery for me. And I'll look into it more. But regarding Paul McCartney and specifically Wings albums, what comes to mind when you were talking about this was a later album. I think their last album in '79 was called Back to the Egg.
Right, exactly. I'm glad you said that. I was,
exactly,
exactly, yeah.
And then, but you started it off by referencing Kenneth Grant. And so what I was thinking about during that time was regarding Grant and and his association to Crowley. And just for the record, I'm not like a Crowleyan as per se. I don't, follow him. I don't study his works per se. And if I were to speak with someone that was a Crowleyan, they would, I wouldn't know, a fraction of what they know, regarding rituals and all that stuff. But I do have an interest in Crowley as a writer, and obviously his mythology, as I'm researching it, as it relates to other things. There's also like just a cultural fascination with the man, because in my opinion, I think he's sort of one of the world's first rock stars, for good or ill, and a lot of ill. He was, there's a lot of problems with Crowley, but anyways, getting to the point, and what I learned is that, now Grant was Crowley's secretary in Crowley's later years. In fact, the last few years of his life, when Crowley was basically flat broke, living in I'm not sure if it was a nursing home per se, but like a place for older folks that are broke, and on meager income, because he had basically spent the fortunes that he inherited from his father on his various, his wild lifestyle, as it were. But anyway, so Grant had requested through mail to meet with Crowley, and so they had met. And I guess at that time, Grant was, in college, or just, quite young. And so that led to basically a secretarial job, which Grant had, that he was doing for Crowley. And that was cut short because Grant's father was complaining that he wasn't making any money. Crowley wasn't giving him any money. And so he was recalled back to what part of England he came from, to Crowley's chagrin. But anyway, at some point though, Crowley, in payment for Grant's work as a secretary, whatnot, he said, "You can have anything you want of like my creations." I think he was referring to his artwork. So Grant's, he eyed this one piece, a portrait of Lamb, which was like a sketch or something of this strange being, which Crowley had termed Lamb. And he said, "I want that." And Crowley said, "Okay, it's yours." And Grant, in turn, went on with this item, this Crowleyan artwork. He went on and basically created his own system of magic and mythology, sort of like using this as a touchstone. He was Grant. He also became the head of the OTO, which was the society which
an order. Yeah.
Yes, the order, the OTO. There was some struggle for power, and then eventually, because of the way Kenneth Grant was going off, taking the Crowleyan teachings in a certain direction, that he was basically, the struggle for power forced him out. So he created his own, which was Typhonian OTO. Now, so the curious thing about this piece of artwork is that it's basically it's an egg-shaped sort of person. It's a person with a head that resembles an egg. I mean, it's really doesn't look like any person you might encounter. And in fact, it looks exactly like what we would refer to nowadays as an alien, or specifically a gray alien. Now, so this was he went on, Grant created this sort of, there was a lot of UFO concepts involved in his branch of magic. But getting back to Lamb and this painting, it came about for Crowley in 1918 when he was doing a ritual and he was invoking certain beings, and he referred to it as the Abramelin work, invocation. And it was during that invocation that his Scarlet Woman had a vision of encountering this creature, which later they would refer to as Lamb. And this Lamb being instructed her to instruct Crowley, go find the egg. And so that's what I was thinking about. Go find the egg. And as well, the painting looks like an egg-shaped person. And so there's a lot of symbolism involved with the egg. And I can't help but thinking in Back to the Egg, the Wings album, that there was some reference to that. Another side note.
Actually, can I just say that with regards to Back to the Egg, if you look at the album cover, it is kind of like the cosmic Back to the Egg. Because if you look at the front cover of the album, their last album, as you say, that was Wings' last album. It's got a picture of all the band in a sitting room, in a living room, with your traditional fireplace. The living room looks very, very traditional, even maybe old world, maybe something from the 1930s or 1940s. That's what I mean by when I say old world. And they're looking towards the floor where there's a hatch, and the hatch has been opened, and out of the hatch they can see beneath them outer space. So we have a cosmic image, a cosmic egg. They can see the planet Earth from the hatch in the floor in this living room. That's the cover Back to the Egg, and also with there's a theme of rebirth with Back to the Egg, because they're going back to the egg, they're going back to the beginning, a rebirth, if you like. And I think at the time, McCartney, when he was asked about this album, if you listen to the album, yeah, there's a lot of heavily produced tracks on there, but but there's also a lot of like rock, kind of raw, kind of what you might describe as just drums, guitars kind of sound to it. And apparently when they were putting the album together, it was meant to be, it never went this way because it got overproduced, or the orchestration, orchestras were used and lots of other added instrumentation. But from what I understand, if I'm not mistaken, the original aim of this Back to the Egg album was to make it a pure rock album with just guitars and drums and vocals. So, and I remember there's a quote from McCartney at the time it came out, or around that time, I think it was, where he said he called it his Back to Square One album, his Back to Basics album. So back to square one. So this is a rebirth. This is a back to the egg. So again, if I'm not reading this wrong, we have a rebirth theme there as well. So that all kind of ties in. An egghead, I am the Eggman, goo goo gajoob, I am the walrus, you know, the lyrics to I Am the Walrus from the Beatles, of course. But yeah.
You know, that's interesting about the album being Back to the Egg being more raw. And that was in response to the reaction to their previous album, London Town, which was definitely an overproduced, like sort of McCartney Wings extravaganza. And it was very popish. And but personally, I really like some of the hits on that album. And
I do too.
I kind of you know, when I think about post Beatles McCartney, I think about like London Town and those silly love songs and things like that. And I'm like, well, you know, hey, that's McCartney. That's what I go to when I want that kind of thing. So, but I think he was getting a lot of backlash. And let's not forget that at that time, the punk movement was like in full, like was rearing its head. And all of the establishment rock bands were getting like really hit on the nose, man. Zeppelin got like, you know what I mean? They were called out. The Sex Pistols were, you know, shutting them down. And the Beatles were an example.
Johnny Rotten had the T-shirt famously with which had the writing "I hate Pink Floyd" on it.
There you go.
It was like a backlash against prog rock, wasn't it? The punk thing.
Yeah.
And indeed, Back to the Egg was produced by the producer of Nevermind the Bollocks. The Sex Pistols album, it was produced. Back to the Egg was produced by none other than Chris Thomas, and that's kind of like a Back to the Egg as well, because Chris Thomas was the sound engineer on the White Album in 1968. So almost 11 years earlier.
You know, the album. Yeah, I guess you're right. You know, I haven't looked at it for a while, and I guess it's in a living room, but. You know, I just, because of the fact that they're all looking at this, it looks like a portal, and they're looking, what is it, the Earth or something? They're in space. I think it's
the Earth,
I just, you know, I forgot over time that it was a living room, and I just equated it with like a spaceship, right?
Yeah.
And I just figured, you know, maybe it's, you know, the interior design is like comfortable, but I just equated it as a spaceship, and that wouldn't. And so when I came across, and so we were talking about Grant and the egg, and it did click in my head when I came across that information back then that there was a reference to Lamb, a Crowley and Grant reference. In the fact that Grant's interpretation of the whole Lamb concept is that these are beings, there are beings that that are visiting us in an from an interdimensional plane, which is really Crowley's whole modus operandi, which is communicating with beings from another plane. Grant was more specific, and so he was looking at this whole like UFO invasion, which sort of began, let's say, a very popular, let's just say, publicized UFO invasion began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold, and then followed by Roswell and all number of manner of things. And this is what I was talking about when Grant sort of took that lamb egg concept football and ran with it in a different direction, was that he really espoused this whole concept that, you know, these aliens these grays are really interdimensional beings. And the egg, another way that he viewed the egg was in fact a flying saucer, which is, you know, some would say it's egg shaped. And so that was one thing I thought McCartney might have been referencing.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
On the Back to the Egg cover.
Yeah.
But that's, you know, that's, I mean, you know, that's just, you know, me I could be superimposing that.
Yeah, that's just another idea to throw out, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Here, among the two of us. With regards to Liber Aber by Aleister Crowley, I'm not sure if I'm actually pronouncing that right. Is it Liber Aber or Liber Aber? But that's, of course, the book where you get the often quoted passage where he states, "Let him write backwards with either hands. Let him constantly watch, if convenient, cinema films and listen to phonograph records reversed. And let him so accustom himself to these that they appear natural and appreciable as a whole. Let him practice speaking backwards. Thus, for I am he, let him say am I. Let him learn to read backwards." And as, of course, the opening line in I Am the Walrus, the Beatles song, which was featured in their 1967 film Magical Mystery Tour, the opening line in that, written by Lennon, is "I am he as you are me." And of course, the Beatles are credited with having created the first ever commercial pop song with backwards vocals, and that was the song Rain from 1966, which I think was on the B-side initially of the single Paperback Writer in the UK, in, as I say, in 66. And you have the final verse there where John Lennon's singing that final verse that he's singing is reversed. So it's being played backwards. And I picked up on some interesting little quotes here that I've accumulated in my research over the years. And this is again to do with McCartney. And this is an actual quote in an interview that he did for a live talk, live on stage a few years back with Jarvis Cocker, the lead singer of the British band Pulp.
Oh, yeah.
Or the former lead singer of the band Pulp. Paul McCartney, recalling his school days, he said, "I have a distant memory of sitting down to write with my left hand and writing my name backwards, mirror writing." And then he looks at the audience at this point. You can get this on YouTube. You can see this. He looks at the audience with a kind of air of humor and says, what does that say about me? And I've got also another quote here from McCartney. I haven't been able to find the actual, confirm whether this is legit or not, but I've got it here for you anyway. But he's also reported to have said, with regards to the same kind of thing, and I quote, "I just always seem to do everything back to front." And he's talking here about his old school days. "I just always seem to do everything back to front. And don't ask me why. I used to write backwards in class. And when the schoolmasters would look at my book, they used to throw little fits at me. I could never learn to ride a bike because I insisted on pedaling backwards. I was quite convinced at the time that mine was the right way. The backwards way was the right way, and that everyone else's way was wrong." So yeah, as I say, make of that what you will. But yeah.
Wow.
It's yeah, and wasn't it the album Chaos and Creation in the Backyard by McCartney that came out in the 2000s? Again, that title, Chaos and Creation, what a title. That kind of conjures things up, doesn't it? But if you look at the cover of that, it's got his name, Paul McCartney, and you can play around with it. If you flip it upside down, it reads the same as it does the right way up.
Regarding, you mentioned that album, the Ram orchestration by, what was it, Percy Thrillington?
Yeah, Percy Thrills Thrillington.
Oh,
yeah.
Thrills Thrillington. Well, you know, McCartney has an entire genre of albums which he wrote under a different moniker as well. Isn't it called Fireman?
The Fireman, yeah, these kind of electronic albums that he did with Youth.
So he definitely goes.
Apollo C. Vermouth was another one, which he wrote one of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band songs under. And it's the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band that are in Magical Mystery Tour in the film, where in the scene in the strip club, where they're actually singing the song Death Cab for Cutie, which again, amongst the P.I.D. community, has been picked up as another clue, because they're singing about the cute one, the one that was known as the cute one in the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and the song is called Death Cab for Cutie. So, of course, this kind of relates to car crashes, and the cute one is killed in it. And he used an assumed name for writing one of their songs or producing it. I can't remember, but Apollo C. Vermouth was the name that Ian Icomo is, of course, the other one, which is Paul McCartney backwards. Ian Icomo, and that's what the Winged Beetle and the Rotten Apple videos that we were talking about earlier picked up on and kind of ran with that as well. Lots of messing around there. He's certainly one for doing that kind of thing.
I think that I think it just shows that that their game for operating on symbolic levels, hidden messages, and all that sort. I mean, their background, their interests, and the way they, put out their work indicates that. They're artists, and highly intelligent and well educated, and so it shouldn't be a surprise that they do that sort of thing.
With regards to Kenneth Grant, going back to Kenneth Grant, I think one of the reasons that we're mentioning him is because his wife, Steffi, between them, they released a series of essays and pictures of some occult illustrations, along with, as I say, some essays to go along with it, that were published, I think, back in the 1960s. I might be wrong about that, but you find some eagle-eyed viewers have spotted a couple of these illustrations, which are called the Carfax monographs, and they revert to Crowley. They're actually illustrations that are referencing Crowley in many respects, and one of them is actually the rose, the cross, and these can be seen. Eagle-eyed viewers have actually found two illustrations of these in the film Magical Mystery Tour. It's in the scene I think it's nearer the end of the film. There's a scene where you see all the Beatles dressed as wizards or magicians, if you like, with the pointy hats, with the pointy wizards hats. And there's a scene where it's Paul, George, and Ringo are in this room, kind of working out magic potions and doing whatever they're doing. And note also that the floor is checkerboard. I'll just throw that in. And at that point, John Lennon walks through with his magician's outfit, with his wizard's hat and everything. And if you look behind him on the wall, there is a load of pieces of paper taped to the wall. And there are a few eagle-eyed viewers have noted that two of the illustrations that are on the back there are from the Carfax monographs. And one of them is an illustration of Crowley. It's a representation of Crowley, and the other one is the Rosy Cross. So yeah, that's another little thing that's been spotted. Again, attaching all this stuff that we're talking about, as I say today, attaching all this symbology to the Beatles.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's a direct link. And if you think about um, them as artists and things, then you think, well, these are their influences. They're kind of hidden. They're not blatant like some of the other bands. Obviously, Ozzy Osbourne, will belch out, Mr. Crowley.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Page's interests in the subject matter are well documented. And the Stones sort of thrive on a sinister image. And regarding actually the Ram cover, an album that came out around that time by the Stones was Goat's Head Soup. So, they were putting out that. I mean, but they're sort of like, they're throwing it in your face. The Beatles are a little more subtle. Having said that, with their interests, but at the resources at their disposal, they can really do a lot. And I think that, like, obviously it's imbued in their music, as you referenced the Rain album as well. Tomorrow Never Knows, a lot of these backmasking, some of the words, the cryptic Crowleyan terms pop up here and there. I'm the Eggman, I am he, etc., etc. Naturally, it only goes to say that they're going to do that with their album covers. So we're all familiar with the more popular interpretations of, like, the Paul is Dead clues on these album covers. But I think now, if you look at it with the understanding of a Crowleyan, or more specifically an Egyptian mythological view, they all really start coming into full focus.
This is the Occult Beatles.
Yes, what you're watching and listening to right now is a presentation in conjunction with my website, The Occult Beatles, and the main feature of this presentation, of course, is my conversation with researcher and writer Andrew Arnett, a conversation I recorded with him via Zoom in January of 2022, and there you hear him making reference to album covers, and specifically, of course, the Beatles album covers. So, okay, it's time now to look into some of their album covers from an occult perspective, of course. And as you heard Andrew say there just a few seconds ago, when it comes to Paul is Dead, there is this, in Andrew's words, popular interpretation. In other words, a general overall perspective that we're all familiar with when it comes to reading so-called P.I.D. clues into some of the band's album covers from 1967 onwards, to albums such as, of course, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, and 1969's Abbey Road album, of course. And these are clues that we're told tie into the claim that McCartney was killed in the latter months of 1966. However, according to what Andrew says he's found in his research, is that there are apparent clues to death, and not only death, but rebirth, in Beatles albums predating September 1966, this date when Paul McCartney is said to have died. One such album is Yesterday and Today, a compilation album released in the US on the Capitol label in June of 1966. And also another album cover worth looking at, says Andrew, is the Beatles album Help from 1965. Now, what I've got coming up for you in just a little while are some excerpts of Andrew from his guest appearance on the previously mentioned broadcast, The Opperman Report, as hosted by Ed Opperman. In the following excerpts that you're going to hear in just a little while, you'll hear Andrew explain his interpretation of both the Help and Yesterday and Today albums, and as I said before, both of which predate September 1966. And also, Andrew makes note of Osiris during his conversation with Ed. Actually, Osiris is quite central to Andrew's research into all of this stuff. If you recall earlier in my conversation with me here, he mentioned, and to paraphrase him, he mentioned that everything has to do with Osiris, the god of the dead, the god of the underworld of the Egyptians. This ties into initiation, mythologized ancient Egyptian initiation of birth, death and rebirth. Now, something else that Andrew explained to Ed Opperman during his conversation, something I'm not going to feature an excerpt of, but it's something that he talked about with Ed Opperman, was with regards to these so-called Paul is Dead clues in albums from 1967 onwards. During his conversation with Ed Opperman, Andrew puts forward the idea that these clues that are seen in albums such as Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road, and that are perceived to be proof that Paul McCartney, that he was killed in 1966, are perhaps being taken too literally, that actually Paul's death wasn't literally him being killed. And to offer up an example of what he means, he talks about the scarab beetle, which is something, of course, that Andrew and I have talked about. And to quote Andrew from his conversation with Ed Opperman, talking about the scarab beetle and how this all ties into P.I.D, and I quote, what Andrew says is, "The scarab beetle holds the key to the Paul is Dead mystery. This small insect is associated with the Egyptian gods by its habit of rolling dung into which it then lays its eggs. The dung provides the young with food. This process of transforming the dead matter of dung into renewed life represents initiation in the ancient Egyptian mysteries. So Paul's death, rather than being a literal thing, can be interpreted as symbolic of this initiation. And the candidate for initiation represents Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Set." So again, this brings us back to Osiris, and Osiris features heavily in Andrew's interpretations of the Yesterday and Today album cover and the Help album cover. Now, the Help album cover, as I said before, the Help album was released in 1965. It's the soundtrack to the Beatles' second feature film. Their first feature film came out in 1964. That was A Hard Day's Night, and 1965 you have Help. Now, if you look at the album cover of Help, this was designed by Robert Freeman. It was photographed and designed by Robert Freeman, and he also designed and photographed the previous album, A Hard Day's Night. Now, according to the official story, the hand signals that the Beatles are displaying on the front cover of the Help album is semaphore. Okay. Now, that's a little bit weird for me in a number of respects. For example, if you've ever watched the film Help, there isn't any reference in the film at all to semaphore. So yeah, if there's no reference in the film to semaphore, why is it on the album cover? Now, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that seeing as the Beatles are standing there spelling out letters, semaphore, on the album cover of Help, you would have thought that the words that they're spelling out, those four letters that they're spelling out there, is help. Well, it's not. The letters that they're spelling out are NUJV, which isn't even a word, let alone anything else. Now, according to Robert Freeman, this is what he said with regards to all this, and I quote, "I had the idea of semaphore spelling out the letters help, but when we came to do the shot, the arrangement of the arms with those letters didn't look good, so we decided to improvise and ended up with the best graphic positioning of the arms." Well, if you want to believe that or not, that is completely up to you, of course. But with regards to this spelling on the front cover of Help, as Andrew explained to Ed Opperman, and as you're about to hear, it would appear, and as you may indeed know, that these letters that the Beatles are spelling out on the front cover of Help are superimposed from a book from Crowley.
Now, this particular book by Crowley is called Liber Ovel Manus Sagittarius Sub Figura 6. Now, in the book, it contains images of hooded figures in Tau robes posing in various positions. Each of these positions convey a different meaning, all of which relate to Egyptian mysticism. And suddenly you see that, well, these actually correspond to the images on Help. So that was, for me, it was really mind-blowing because, that was like an example. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a coincidence, but that's just the start of it. You know what I'm saying? Osiris rising. He is the god of the dead in Egyptian mythology. And really, it's the key to much of Crowley's work. He has books like the Book of Thoth and stuff. It's all based, he penned a lot of, groundbreaking stuff as far as he's concerned in Egypt, and a lot of it relates to that. In the Egyptian mystery schools, when they were like initiating these into their theology in the pyramids, let's say, they would sometimes be referred to as scarabs, as in Beatles. In other words, they were the Beatles as they were being initiated. So I just thought that was a curious connection there. Khepra, again, is the beetle-headed god. He is the king of the insect world. The scarab beetle holds the key to the Paul is dead mystery. Now, Osiris's consort, which is Isis in this theology, then reassembles his body, gives birth to the resurrected god Horus, and then that completes the cycle of death and rebirth. So that's, and then that opens the door. And then with this knowledge, I started looking again at the Beatles clues, the Beatles albums and their songs, and I had a renewed sort of view of it that overlaid the Paul is Dead clues and added more. I'll just reference a few of those at this time. So we're looking at the earlier Beatles albums, and we mentioned Help, which is in '65, and then later that year, within a year, they put out Yesterday and Today, which is an American Capitol release, and that came out Revolve, and this came out before the alleged death of Paul McCartney. Now, the interesting thing about Yesterday and Today is that it actually has two covers, and the one we see now that you can buy in the store, but the first cover was notoriously referred to as the Butcher cover. But then they recalled it all, and believe it or not, they bought them all back and buried them in the ground. So because they thought it was offensive. But most of Beatles aficionados, you're familiar with this image. They're all sitting there in a studio, but they all have like these hacked up body meat parts and doll parts, and they're dressed in butchers' uniforms, and there's blood and guts everywhere. The second one that was put out is more tame. It's like, well-dressed, well-mannered Beatles. They're all sit in pose, except that Paul is in a trunk at the foot. When I looked into this sort of Egyptian mystery of Osiris, I realized that, hey, there's a strange coincidence here. What happens in this cycle, this whole this cycle of this god, let's say, dynamic, is that Osiris is killed, as I mentioned, by his brother Set. What happens is that, Set is jealous or whatever. He's motivated to kill Osiris. So at this party, Set builds this box. It actually is a tomb, and he invites everybody to sit in it, all the other gods. When Osiris sits in this trunk, literally, he slams the door shut, throws the tomb into the river. So understanding that, and I'm looking, well, hey, Paul is dead. That's the symbol. This one of these, images for yesterday and today, which came just prior. It came out in June, and he's supposed to have died in September of '66. Came out in June. Here he is in a trunk. Okay, it corresponds in a way with that killing of Osiris by Set. Now, Osiris is floating in a trunk in the river, and he it lands on the bank, and it gets stuck on a tree. This tree sort of grows over it, and then a local king admires it, cuts it down, puts it in as a column in his palace. Isis, which is the Osiris's wife, is mourning. She's looking for it. She realizes that Osiris is in there. She takes him out and hides him. But Set discovers this, and then so he takes him. He finds Osiris a second time, and this time he hacks him up into a million pieces. And Isis is sort of looking for his body parts everywhere until they finally put him together, and then they create. They merge once again and create Horus, which is the new god. But anyway, two death images portrayed in one album. So, I thought, hey, this is interesting.
Yeah, so there you go. Andrew in conversation with Ed Opperman on the Opperman Report. And coming up now, Andrew in conversation with me again. And we're talking about album covers, moving on to 1967 and the Sgt. Pepper cover.
We're all familiar with, a lot of the Paul is Dead clues on that, which have been written about, many times. Obviously it's a funeral ceremony. There's a flower bed in the shape of a left-handed bass guitar, designating Paul. There's 3 strings, so that means one string is gone. They're mourning. There's the old Beatles, the new Beatles. Beatles are sort of mournful, looking over. There's, there are other items like there's apparently there's it looks like a car crash, or some people describe.
Oh yeah, the doll with "Welcome
Yes.
the Rolling Stones." I think
Welcome,
it's written.
yeah.
Yeah, there's the doll and there's a car, a toy car on her lap, I think it is, and it's said to be and there's a glove. There's a driving glove next to her, which is
a bloody glove.
A bloody glove, yeah.
And Paul is holding a black woodwind instrument, where the others are carrying brass instruments. So, another indicator of death. My favorite in that group of clues being the mirror held up to the bass drum. This is very popular stuff, and it's a lot of fun. But the proof of the pudding, a lot of stuff has come out since then. Now, have you seen the image of the album folded over in half, diagonally and folded over?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you do that, suddenly, because Crowley, of course, is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's. But he's one of many people, and he's just kind of like randomly in the back row somewhere.
Yeah.
If you do this fold, suddenly a remarkable thing pops out. If you mirror it diagonally, you see at the very top of this diamond shape, Crowley's head. He's the top head. At the very bottom, the flowers form an insignia. It looks just like the A, of which is Crowley's signature for Aleister Crowley, which he famously sort of portrayed like a penis. That's how he shaped the A. And the A is right there at the bottom. There are some more symbols in the middle, which designate a sort of an emblem, OTO, or I forget the term for it, but a Crowleyan symbol. And then also significantly the palm tree that was on the side, one side, is now borders both sides of this image. And that also has a strong Egyptian symbology. Specifically speaking, it would, in masonry, that would be indicated by the two arches, the Boaz, Jachin sort of pillars.
Yeah.
That's a remarkable image right there.
Yeah.
And the way to put that together, it, you know, is a level of genius, maybe. But one thing I mentioned on with Richard Surratt on Coast to Coast was a revelation that came out more recently, because production photos of the creation of the album had been released more recently, like in the past 10 years. And we all know that it was, they were made from, you know, cardboard cutouts, you know, all these
enlarged. Yeah, they were photographs. Yeah, that were enlarged. Yeah,
yeah, life
to
size,
body size. Yeah, life size.
Life size cutouts. Now, so the cool thing is that in these pictures, it is revealed that some of them were obscured. Some of these life-size cutouts were obscured because they were behind another cutout, or they were behind a band member. Now, behind George Harrison is a photo, is one of these cardboard cutouts of a person that doesn't appear on the cover. Only a little fragment of his back can be seen from behind the left side of Harrison's like head. And it turns out these production photos reveal that that is a photo cutout of an actor named Timothy Carey, who is specifically from a scene in a Stanley Kubrick film called The Killer, which was made in '56. And in this particular cutout, in this scene, it's taken from this scene where Carey is holding a gun, a rifle, and he's about to shoot this rifle. And the scene as it plays out in the film is that he's a hired hitman, hired by there's a group of gangsters, and they have this basically this heist plan to basically rob it's a racetrack of its earnings, right? And so what it is that to create a distraction, Carey is he goes to, his assignment is to go to the racetrack and shoot the lead horse, the horse that is one of the horses that's in, and that's going to cause a distraction. And so he actually does that. In the on Sgt. Pepper's, it's his image is obscured by George Harrison. The gun is it extends all the way over to behind Paul McCartney, and if you look at, you gauge it, it is directly the barrel of the gun is right standing in front of that is Paul McCartney himself, the real life Paul McCartney, you know, as he's posing for that album cover. Right behind him, obscured to the, you know, to the viewer of the album, is this, you know, barrel of this gun. And, you know, that was this, no one knew about that for maybe 50 years. If you look at the symbolism, of course, that plays into Paul is Dead, you know. Yeah. And if you look at the Kubrick symbol, like why? I mean, it could be anybody. It could be, if they want to do that, they could take an image of anyone, like picture of Rambo or someone shooting someone. If Rambo was around back in the 60s, right? Or
Lancaster,
like Clint Eastwood or someone, or Lancaster.
Yeah.
But I mean, just regarding that, look, there, it's like, okay, the symbolism has something to do with the fact that the killer is taking out the lead horse in the race. You know, Paul McCartney is a, you know, he can be equated to that, a very profitable lead racehorse. You know, what I mean, there's a lot of symbolism related to that. Now, that right there, I consider that the smoking gun as far as
Yeah,
the
I mean,
PID
just
thing.
to add in here, I mean, we know that John Lennon has always been regarded as the leader of the Beatles because he was the one that put them together, and he was the one that the rest of the band members would look to when the decision had to be made. He was the de facto, unspoken of leader. But in terms, but McCartney was very much a creative force, so you could say he was a front runner because he was the one, as most of the Beatles, I think, if not all of them, have since said after the split, that when it came to recording an album or getting together to record new material, it was always McCartney that got them together to do it. He would be the one bringing them all up, getting them off their vacations or lying on a beach somewhere and saying to them, hey, look, guys, it's time to get back together and do some more music. He was like the force, if you like. And he was always the one that was coming up with stuff and being productive in the studio with George Martin, their producer. And so in that, I can see what you mean, lead horse in that respect. In that respect alone, he's very much that, isn't he? You know, and he was the most commercial one of the Beatles as well. He was the one that whose songs were played more in supermarkets and like Yesterday and all of that kind of thing. He was kind of like, whereas Lennon was a little bit more left field with his songwriting. McCartney was very much more commercial than. But yeah, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that the Lennon as the leader is a very interesting concept, and it plays into their whole Egyptian mythology. And I think that they play up on it. And there's no doubt he is a leader in many senses. Yeah. But Paul is also a leader. However, you know.
So the gun by taking out the lead horse is taking out Paul in the film.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. I mean, that's just as far as the film is concerned. But yeah, the guy that plays the film, Timothy Carey, is, I mean, this guy is a whole nother, it's a whole nother world with this guy. I mean, once I started getting into this Timothy Carey guy, it opened up another world. I mean, it blew my mind. This guy is, he's a phenomenon. But to begin, well, we know he's in The Killing. And then Kubrick used Carey in his following film, Paths of Glory, which came out in 1957. Now, Carey is such an eccentric that they're trying to do this scene. It wasn't like he was the star. He was doing a cameo scene for a specific sort of like thing. And he had to play one of these soldiers to be executed. And they were having their last meal, and they're having a duck meal. That was the scenario. But Carey was so hard to work with. He was such a wild man that apparently it took Stanley Kubrick 57 shots to do it. And then he gave up. He eventually got someone else to play the Carey part for that scene. He used some of the other scenes with Carey in it, but that whole scene was played out with someone with his back to the camera. So this Carey guy is really strange. Now, he, first of all, he's, as far as in real life, he's the nephew, it turns out, of these two guys. He has two uncles that worked for Al Capone, right? He was born in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and I guess he is of Irish descent. But he made this, and he appears in a lot of other films as well. But he had this vision for a film. He went ahead and he produced the film, He wrote the film, he directed the film, and he was the leading actor in the film, in a film that came out in '62 called World's Greatest Sinner. And I got a hold of this film and I watched it. It's an underground classic. It was like, I think it played in LA for like, to a limited sort of view, like a couple of theaters for a couple of months, and then it was off. They never replayed it. Nobody saw it again for like another 40 years. It was replayed on TCM, Turner, I think one of these Turner stations, like in the 2000s, and it was introduced by his son. This film is sheer underground, like madness. But the basic concept of the film is that this guy, Timothy Carey, plays this guy. He's like an insurance salesman, and he's fed up with his job, right? And he has this calling. He's speaking, it's hosted, I mean, it's narrated by a snake, right? Obviously referencing, you know, the snake in the Garden of Eden. This snake says, go out there, start a rock band, you know, live your life, whatever. This guy goes ahead and he creates an entire, he gets a rock band, he learns to play guitar, and he does this wild, ecstatic kind of rock stuff. To like, and his audiences are like screaming teenage girls. This is in '62, and they love him. And he's writhing on the stage, and he's not a good-looking guy. He's overweight, and in the film, he looks just like Marilyn Manson, and a little like Frank Zappa with the goatee. Turns out that Frank Zappa wrote the soundtrack for this. This is back in '62, so there's some serious lineage there.
And '62 is also the year that the Beatles got their first record contract and released their first record.
Interesting. He's told to smash his guitar. This is before the Who and Pete, you know, and Pete Townsend did their thing. He's doing a lot of stuff, and he's preaching. He's creating his own religion. He has actually a name for the religion, and it's something like the Party of the Eternal Man, or something to that effect. And he's saying every person is a god, and we will live forever. We're immortal. So here's the interesting thing. Well, there are quite a few interesting aspects. The part of the public are starting to rebel again. Like, they don't like him. They're saying he is like anti-God. He's like the Antichrist. They're saying he's bigger. You know, it references what John Lennon said when he said, oh, you know, we're bigger than Jesus, and the controversy that happened there. The film goes on, like, the next part is like someone comes along and says, you know, you could go even further than this rock stuff. You know, go into politics. He runs for president. And it's an incredible thing that and then it goes from like a Beatles, what I felt a lot of Beatles rock references, predating, by the way, all the wildness of the later '60s, because up till then, you know, rock wasn't. This guy's, you should, if you get a chance, listen to some of the stuff from this album. It's great. This Carey guy is a real. He's a handful. Check that out.
There's other links. There's another link that I noticed regarding Kubrick and possible P.I.D. Paul is Dead. And incidentally, by the way, regarding Timothy Carey, what you just mentioned about that movie. Wow. Yeah. I don't know if you've noticed this in the film The Shining by Kubrick, directed by Kubrick and starring Jack Nicholson, of course, as Jack Torrance, and his wife is Wendy Torrance in the film. Now, the film was released in 1980, if I'm not mistaken. 1980. Now, that's the year that John Lennon was shot dead. In the opening scenes of, I'll get to the P.I.D. reference in just a moment, that I perceive could perhaps be a P.I.D. reference. But before I do, there's this other thing we have in the opening scenes, nearer the opening scenes of the film. We see a scene with Wendy Torrance as she's sitting at a table and she's reading a book, and the book she just happens to be reading is Catcher in the Rye, which is the J.D. Salinger novel, which was later found to be in the possession of Mark Chapman, who was arrested at the scene of John Lennon's shooting, found at the scene reading the book. And of course, we've since come to learn that this was his trigger book. So this kind of like goes into the realms of, possible mind control, MK Ultra, elements of that with regards to John Lennon's killing. With regards to P.I.D, possible elements of P.I.D, I don't know if you've watched the movie. At the beginning, in the opening credits, we see the character that's played by Jack Nicholson. We see Jack Torrance on his way. He's driving along the mountains and he's on his way to a job interview. And this is where he eventually gets the job to be caretaker of this Overlook Hotel, which is where most of the action then occurs in the most of the film. If you notice, the car that he's driving on the way to this interview in the mountains is a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. Right, so we've got beetle. So again, we have this beetle as in the insect. Okay, perhaps connotation. But then if you think of the Volkswagen Beetle, we also see it on the cover of Abbey Road. And again, this ties into P.I.D because, of course, as the P.I.D theory tells us, informs us, if you look at the cover of the Abbey Road album cover, you've got the Beatles walking across the crossing there, and behind them, parked up, is a white Volkswagen Beetle, and on the registration number reads 28IF. It reads 28 if Paul McCartney was still alive, and so on, which he wouldn't have been, actually. He would have been 27 had he been alive in 1969 when the album was released. But anyway, the point is we get this Volkswagen Beetle symbology in the Abbey Road album, and we see it here in the opening scenes of The Shining. Much later on in the movie, towards nearer the end of the film, there's a snowstorm that occurs where the hotel where Jack Nicholson's character is working and where he's living with his wife Wendy and their child, the young son. There's a snowstorm, and we see the remains of a car crash. It looks as though a truck has collapsed on top of a car. The car that it's collapsed on top of, the car underneath, is a Volkswagen Beetle, a red Volkswagen Beetle. So if you're looking at it from a P.I.D perspective, perhaps that red would signify blood. And of course, this takes us back to the car crash scenario. Paul McCartney, 1966, killed in a car crash. I don't know if you've seen that yourself in The Shining. It's something I've noticed myself. I don't know if it has any relevance to P.I.D, but it's Kubrick certainly. Kubrick was one of these people who was very, very, very conscientious, famously conscientious about his movies, about how they were made. This is well documented. Anything that you see in a Kubrick movie has been put there by Kubrick for a reason. So
well, The Shining, I didn't recognize, I didn't see the Beetle driving car. I mean, that didn't click with me in my memory, but that hotel and that film is filled with amazing symbology. And I actually know it quite well.
Where was that filmed? Where is that hotel?
Well, it's north of Denver.
Right. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, they mentioned that in the film.
In a hotel called the Stanley Hotel.
Stanley. Right. Well, yeah. Stanley was the maiden name of John Lennon's mother, Julia.
Okay.
Julia Stanley.
Interesting.
So I'll just throw that in anyway. Yeah.
There's a lot of double. Of course, the famous twins are in there, and in fact, the film is based on two hotels. The Overlook. There's another hotel in Oregon, and then there's a lot of weird references to that. but and that's a whole nother story of which I need to bone up on before I get into that. But you mentioned Abbey Road, and you mentioned the beetle on the cover, 28 If, and also, what was it, LMW?
LMW,
Yeah, which some have interpreted as either Linda McCartney Weeps or Linda McCartney Widow, what have you, and then all the other famous symbols of that. Now, if you plug in the Egyptian understanding, the Crowley understanding, and you look at the album cover of Abbey Road, it's a whole new level of meaning comes out. Now, we understand that traditionally that the P.I.D. clues are interpreted as this is they're going to a funeral or it's a funeral procession. Well, in the front is Lenin, and he represents kind of like the preacher, because he is dressed in white. He's the leader. He's got like a mane of hair. Behind him is Ringo, dressed in all black, very well dressed in all black. He represents the Undertaker. The third person is looked at as, that's Paul McCartney, and he's viewed as the dead person, and because, as they say, he's out of step, he's barefoot, he's carrying a cigarette, referencing a cancer stick, the death stick, and curiously enough, he's holding it in his right hand. So
he's meant to be left-handed, of course, and
right. And then the fourth,
real,
well, the person there then is his replacement, the double.
Yeah.
So, and then the fourth person is George Harrison, dressed in denim, and he's supposed to be the grave digger. Okay. Now, look, if you look at this in terms of Egyptian mythology, and then specifically the Osiris view and its implications of an initiation, because I think that's what really is going on here. And it shows that he didn't die per se, but he died a spiritual death. And I think that's the meaning behind a Crowley or any kind of initiation rite. So, you're evolving. It's a death to the lower self, and all the symbology related to that. If you look at the album cover, this is what I see. You look at it in terms of the sun god, the Ra and the Osiris cycle. At the top is Ra, which is the sun god, and then comes the deity Set. Okay, and then Set is he's viewed as the murderer of Osiris, his brother. Okay, and then the fourth deity in the major Egyptian theology is Horus. Okay, and he's sort of like he's the emerging, he's the young, he comes out of a union between Osiris and Isis. Now, what you really have here is, and mind you, when Crowley, when he spoke and he wrote the Book of Law and all that, he exclaimed that this is the age of Horus, the Aeon of Horus. Okay, so this is a big part of Crowleyan view, but he's using Egyptian references, right? Now, if you look at it from an astrotheological viewpoint, and these deities, what are they representing? The sun. So you have the sun in the 4 stages of the day or the season. So you have, so Ra is associated with the noonday sun or summer. Set is associated with the fall equinox and the evening sun. Now, okay, and then Osiris, of course, as the midnight sun. the sun at night, and you can't even see it because it's dead. Horus, of course, and that would be this the winter solstice. And then Horus would indicate the spring equinox or the rising sun. Now, what if these four Beatles are playing out these four parts? And it seems to make sense because in the front, right, you have John Lennon. He's dressed all in white, and he has a mane and a beard, just like a lion, which, as we mentioned earlier, the lion is the king of the animal kingdom. And so it represents the sun, as in Leo represents the sun.
Yeah. Also,
right?
on the album, on Abbey Road, the album, you have the song Here Comes the Sun. And you also have Sun King, the song Sun King, which is another song from Abbey Road. Okay,
let's look at this. Let's plug this in. Who sings Here Comes the Sun? Okay,
George.
It's George Harrison. George Harrison is the fourth person. If you look at the line, walking in line, you have Ra in the front, as in John Lennon. The second person is Ringo, as in he's playing the part of Set. And indeed, he's dressed all in black.
Black.
And he is the Undertaker. The third person in line is Osiris. So he's the winter solstice. He's the dead man. He's the dead god. And he's being murdered by Set. Set, by the way, is another term for the setting sun.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sunset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Osiris gives birth, with his wife Isis, gives birth to Horus. And then that's played by George Harrison. George, of course, he sings Here Comes the Sun. So that's the coming sun. Lennon sings Sun King because he's the established sun. And again, Harrison dressed all in blue denim. You know, yes, he's the gravedigger, but he's also he's dressed like a farmer. And that's sort of associated with Horus as well. Agriculture and the time of planting the seeds and whatnot.
And George Harrison was an avid gardener.
Absolutely
fanatical on gardening.
Is that was right?
That was his number one thing, you know, above music, perhaps even. That was especially when the Beatles broke up and he bought this great big mansion in Henley-on-Thames in the UK with this palatial home with all these massive grounds of you know, garden and you know, and that was his pastime, was to reinvigorate this garden which had been left in some disrepair as far as I'm aware. But yeah, he was an absolute fanatic on gardening. That was his number one thing.
Yeah.
Till the end of his life, you know.
There you go. I mean, I haven't looked, that's, you know, I haven't seen it looked at in that way. And so that's what I see with my understanding. You know, it's kind of funny that Lennon, but anyway, yeah, so that's one way of looking at it.
You've tapped into something else that I've discovered. I don't know if you know about this. This is again taken from an article I mentioned earlier. And again, this is, if you recall, I mentioned the ram-headed Khnum, the creator. There's an ancient Egyptian creation deity, a fellow ancient creation deity, who's closely, as far as I'm aware, is closely associated with Khnum, the creator. It's a female deity who's, depending on where you look, has either been described as Khnum's consort and or his counterpart. And her name was Heket or Hekat, a goddess, it said, of life-giving and rebirth. Okay, so here we go again with the rebirth theme. But just stick with me here. I'll get to my point. Now she like Khnum, as we explained earlier, is half human with the head of an animal, so the head of a ram. Hekat or Heket is the same, has the body of a human with the head of a frog. Now, do you remember Do you remember "We All Stand Together," the Paul McCartney song that came out in '84? It was a massive hit in the UK. It got to top 10 twice, actually. Got to number 2 in 1984, and then it went back to number 2 the following year in '85. Do you remember that song, "We All Stand Together"?
It's yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm sure I know it. Yeah. Yes,
by
I know that
Paul
song.
McCartney and the Frog Chorus.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
Right?
Okay. I
So,
know about that project. It's like it's like an animal. It's like a children's book or something as well.
yeah,
or
it's
animation.
yeah.
Sure, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
It was a 12-minute animation that
Right.
Paul McCartney put together in the 80s. He bought the rights basically to an old comic strip story, a children's comic strip story by a character called Rupert the Bear, which was this bear that acted like a human, dressed in clothes. It had lived in a little house with mummy and daddy, and and he had a group of friends. I think one of them was a badger, I think, off the top of my head. Another one was an elephant. But it was like a kid's tale, a children's tale. And Paul McCartney had bought the rights to that. And I do actually remember Rupert the Bear as a child watching it on TV. They did like an animated kind of show for kids' TV. So yeah, he bought the rights to it. And what he did was he put together a 12-minute short, an animated film.
Yeah.
Starring Rupert the Bear and a load of frogs. Now, the thing is, at the time, I mean, since the Beatles have broken up, Paul McCartney has got a lot of derision for his music. He's been accused of being bland, not as vital in his sound as he was in the Beatles, middle of the road. And you can kind of see where people are going with that. I mean, he did actually record Mary Had a Little Lamb, the nursery rhyme. He recorded it with Wings back in the early 70s. So he does tend to go into these directions at times, but for all the derision that he's had since the Beatles have broken up for his middle of the road directions that he's taken, I would suggest that he never got as much derision, and still to this day has not had as much derision as he got in 1984 when he released this frog song. Paul McCartney and the Frog Chorus, "We All Stand Together," which is basically a kid's song. It's a song of Paul McCartney singing along with the voices of what are meant to be frogs as the chorus. It's a kid's song, but he's had so much derision for this song, and people have said, why, man? What possessed McCartney to go ahead and make this silly song? Well, you could say, well, of course, the reason they put together this silly song was because it was the soundtrack to this kid's short, this animated short, this 12-minute short they put together. It's the theme song for it. But what I find quite strange is if you actually watch this 12-minute short, which ends with this song, "We All Stand Together," as kind of like the parading piece of the entire film. If you watch this 12-minute short, you'll notice that in the film, Rupert the Bear, if you watch Rupert the Bear, if you've read any of the comic strips or seen the TV shows that, as I say, were back in I remember watching back in the day, they're mostly centered around Rupert and this group of friends of his that I mentioned, the little the badger, the elephant, and I think there was a mouse as well. It's adventures based around Rupert and his friends. So his friends are always around. In this particular 12-minute short, and you would have thought that they would have been around in this, seeing as this 12-minute short was released as a theatrical release. So I think this is the first ever time that Rupert the Bear was ever released theatrically. But would you believe it? In this theatrical release, these regular figures that feature in Rupert's stories are only in the animated film for about, about a minute, maybe even less than a minute. And that's it. And they're not in the rest of the film. The rest of the film, the rest of the animated short is taken up with Rupert and frogs. And what happens is Rupert is going along his daily business and he comes across this secret world inhabited by all these frogs. And the point that he gets involved, the point that he stumbles into this secret world is at the point where these frogs are getting ready for some kind of spectacle, an extravaganza, if you will. which culminates in the song "We All Stand Together" being played out. And at the end of the song, as it ends, the frogs are looking towards a pond or a river, not quite sure what it is, but some water. And out of this water emanates these two giant frogs. I mean, giants. We're not talking like normal sized frogs. We're talking they tower over the rest of the scenery that's there around them. And they are the Frog Queen and the Frog King, and they rise out of the water. Now, okay, stay with me on this, okay?
I'm with you.
Okay, Heket or Hekat, okay, is symbolically connected to the River Nile, as is Khnum, okay? And Khnum is also, it's been dubbed the King of Frogs. So this ram-headed deity is also been dubbed the King of Frogs. I've got a quote here, which I featured in this article of mine on the Occult Beatles that I mentioned earlier. And I featured this information about the frogs and everything. And I've got a quote here that is also in this article. And this is a quote from 19th century poet and writer and researcher of ancient Egypt, Gerald Massey. And in his book, in his written work, Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World, he states, the frog was a lunar type. The name of the frog in Egyptian is Ka, whence the lunar lady, who was represented as a frog, is designated Mistress Heka or Hekat, who was consort of the solar god Khnum Ra. Okay, so here we go with this is what I was getting to, the solar, you know, the cycle here again, the solar symbology, if you like. So Mistress Hekat or Heka was consort of the solar god Khnum Ra. An inscription in the British Museum tells us that under one of his titles, Khnum was called the King of Frogs. There is no proof, perhaps, of his being a frog himself, but his son had a frog-headed form, and his consort Hekat is the frogess. Khnum Ra is the nocturnal sun, and Hekat, his consort, is a representative of the moon that transforms in the lower hemisphere as the tadpole emerges from the waters in the form of a frog. So again, we have this the frog emerging, the frog figure emerging from the waters. Now, if you look on the internet and you type in Heket or Hekat for an image of what Hekat is represented as, to me, it looks identical, almost identical to the Frog Queen and the Frog King, the so-called Frog King and the Frog Queen that emanate from the waters in this We All Stand Together visual piece, in this animated film. Almost identical. They're holding rods, almost identical, a robe. It's, yeah. So, and just to close here, Hekat has also been linked to Khepra as well. And in the book, The Coffin of Hecata, this is a book by Professor of Egyptology, Harco Willems, the author of that book as well. He writes, there is an analogy. This is something we've mentioned already previously. There is an analogy between the mysterious birth process of the frog, Hekat, and that of the scarab, Khepra. The Egyptians believed that both were born spontaneously from the earth. As a result of this self-generative aspect, the gods came to be understood as creators and as such as being involved in the process of solar rebirth. So there you have it, the frog, rebirth, Egypt, the ram, it's all in there.
Well, you know, it's not surprising. That's an amazing connection. And I haven't even looked into that aspect of the Egyptian mythology aspect, but that's cool to see the beetle and the frog connected in that way. I was just thinking,
all these, I was going to say, for all these people over the decades that have laughed at McCartney for making this song, this childish song, and wondering what on earth is he, what is he thinking, man? Maybe that's what he was thinking.
Well, you know, I think this is what they're thinking all along. I was reading one of your articles the other day on Abbey Road, and it was a fascinating sort of deep dive into Abbey Road and John Woods and the history of the area of which the album cover was, the picture was taken. And of course, the EMI studio, Abbey Roads, is located right there. And the fact that a lot of like these spiritual gurus of note from the past lived within walking distance, specifically speaking, the Helena Blavatsky lady, and that she lived nearby.
She died there, as far as I'm aware. She saw out her last days in St. John's Wood, the district of London where Abbey Road is situated, just streets away.
That's fascinating. I mean, they grew up with this sort of milieu, but then also you went on to research and note that her followers, specifically like Annie Besant,
yeah,
right, and Alice Bailey and her husband, and how they went on to espouse, and really the Blavatsky herself, their mission was to sort of spread this sort of Far Eastern or Near Eastern, if you will, these forms of theology, which
Indian mysticism,
things of that nature, and that this sort of permeated into. I mean, you make some amazing connections with like the UN and things of that nature, but certainly this was part of the Zeitgeist, if you will, of like the 60s, and how they were spreading this whole thing. And who was the leader of this? The Beatles. And then it gets back to Abbey Road. It reminds me of like when they were working on Abbey Road and it came time to shoot the cover. And of course, they, as usual, they had some far-flung, ambitious notion. And in this case, the original concept, whether it was by Lennon or whoever, was that they wanted to call it Everest, and they wanted to fly the band to Mount Everest and shoot it as a backdrop. So, but then it got so busy, and then when it came time to, hey, the company said we need a cover for the album, they're like, we don't have time for that. So the story goes is that McCartney or someone was like, well, let's just walk outside and take a shot of Abbey, down Abbey Road, because we don't have time to go to Everest. And so this whole thing, that's the story, that's the backstory. We're going to do that instead. But the notion of the original album, the Everest album, is interesting because in Everest, of course, is located, that's where Tibet is located. And that's obviously a lot of this mysticism originated from, and then, you have the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which influenced Lennon and the song Tomorrow Never Knows. And then, of course, Harrison, his music, Within You, Without You, his sitar playing.
The Maharishi.
But going back to Blavatsky and those, they talked about, these spiritual gurus that, come from that region. And then going back to Crowley, of course, Crowley was he viewed himself as a mountain climber, and he attempted Everest as well, but he bailed out on that. He didn't make it that far. But the notion of like Everest and Abbey Road, there's a connection there, in the sense that, look, both of these places have a spiritual basis, and the mission of the Beatles, on one deeper level, might be that, as you mentioned in the article, that, hey, we want to spread this mythology, this, these teachings from the Far East, as Blavatsky had done, and her followers. And so there's a link there, which, that I found plausible.
It's amazing, isn't it, to think that Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, wanted to bring forth to the West, as we call it, Eastern ideas, as you say, Indian mysticism, as we call it. And she was around in much earlier decades. She passed away in decades much earlier to when the Beatles first came to the fore publicly. I think it was around I can't remember when she passed away.
I think she passed away before Crowley even, of course. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So these were figures that were around in the late 19th into the 19th century into the 20th century. And yeah, that was her mission, was to bring what we now call New Age, I suppose, religions or beliefs or lifestyles into the so-called West. Amazing to think that she saw out the last days of her life living in St. John's Wood, just blocks away from Abbey Road. Abbey Road and where she passed away were in the same area, St. John's Wood. To think that she passed away there, and then many decades later, the Beatles came to Abbey Road and kind of like finished off what she'd begun, brought these beliefs that she wanted, brought these lifestyles to the West in a massive way, because it was the Beatles that, whatever anyone says, it was the Beatles that, with their popularity, that helped to bring these kind of lifestyles and beliefs to the West, you know, through the Maharishi and mysticism and meditation, and which before the Beatles was something that was certainly not a mainstream thing. With regards to Kubrick, there's another thing I noticed which is in The Shining, you don't see it for very long. Again, you have to be a little bit eagle-eyed, I suppose, not completely eagle-eyed, but a little bit. You have to be watching the film. You can't be having the film on your screen and you sitting there sort of looking around the room. You have to be focused. There's a very short scene where we see the twin girls. Now we know twins has a heavy allusion, a heavy link towards MK Ultra, mind control. We have twinning with regards to that, the use of twins. If you look on the wall, there's a scene where the twin girls are standing up, and right next to them or behind them on the wall, there's a poster advertising some kind of enterprise, some kind of business, and it says on it Monarch. So that instantly, for me, when I saw that, I thought twins, mind control, MK Ultra, and then we've got Monarch mind control, which was part of the MK Ultra program. We had this subdivision of it, or this part of it, that was called Monarch mind control. So again, that's just something that I noticed while I was watching it. Again, you know, why, you know, as I said, you know, as we've said, you know, Kubrick didn't put these things in his films for no reason. They weren't haphazard. They certainly weren't random. But yeah, that got me thinking as to what was going on there, perhaps. And I didn't think of it before, but yeah, yeah, wow, yeah, of course. You were saying earlier about Paul is dead, and you could also look at those twins as being doubles. So of course we have the P.I.D. element coming in there as well. Back to Magical Mystery Tour as well. I know there's a part of Magical Mystery Tour where we see Paul McCartney dressed as a military man. And he's sitting behind a desk, and in front of him there's a sign that says I was. Part of the sign reads I was. Some people within the P.I.D. community have said that this is basically a clue, suggesting that Paul McCartney is sitting behind this sign because he's saying I was Paul McCartney, but I am no longer Paul McCartney, because this is post 1966, this is 1967, this that you're looking at now sitting behind this desk is actually his replacement. I was Paul McCartney, as in the real Paul McCartney. But of course, as you probably know yourself, others have looked at I was and have connected it to I was, or IWAS, AIWASS, IWAS, or I was, however you want to pronounce it, which was this Crowley described it as this outer being, didn't he? That not possessed him, but came into his body, manifested inside of him, in order that he could write his infamous work, or his famous work, his written work, the Book of the Law. He claims that Aiwass was this being that came inside of him and effectively made him write this book. Other critics or other commentators have suggested that perhaps this was Crowley's subconscious, and that Aiwass was actually his subconscious. But yeah, whatever. Aiwass, that's how some people have perceived that sign that McCartney is sitting behind to be. It's actually not I was, as in I was Paul McCartney and now I'm a replacement, but Aiwass, as in this outer being. To quote Crowley here, with regards to Aiwass, call him a devil or a god or even an elemental as you will. That's how he describes him. He is also been described as the first letter of the alphabet, whose number is 1, and his card in the tarot is the Fool. The Fool on the hill. I don't know. I just throw that out there for you, but yeah.
That's a fascinating connection.
This the Occult Beatles.
Yes, it is, and you're listening to a conversation I recorded with Andrew Arnett in January 2022, and we're coming up to the final home stretch of that conversation I recorded with Andrew. But before we hear that, I'd just like to add some extra bits of information here, and some of that information is with regards to Paul McCartney and Aleister Crowley. Here's a picture of a very young Aleister Crowley. It has been suggested that a very young Aleister Crowley doesn't half look like a very young Paul McCartney. And I think the insinuation being that it's possible these two guys are blood related. Hold that thought, okay? Hold that thought. Here's a picture of a much older Aleister Crowley, a picture of Aleister as taken from the Sgt. Pepper album cover. Now, what somebody's done, there's a P.I.D. Facebook page, and what somebody's done on that page is they've taken this picture of Aleister Crowley's face, and what they've done is they've cut it in half, and they've deleted half of Aleister Crowley's face and replaced it with half of the face of James McCartney, Paul McCartney's son. Here it is. Okay, with regards to Paul McCartney and Aleister Crowley, you may be aware of this actually. Back in the 2000s, whilst Paul McCartney was touring the world with his live concert tour, he had on stage with him a projector screen which was behind him on stage, and it transmitted flashing images to the audience, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the flashing images that was being transmitted to the audience was of Aleister Crowley, of that picture from the Sgt. Pepper album cover. Okay, before I hand you over to Andrew, just a few bits of additional information, and this is with regards to the beetle, as in the insect the beetle. If you recall earlier, Andrew and I touched very briefly on the diary entry that apparently came from McCartney from 1961, in which we see in McCartney's diary apparently him scribbling around with what looks like ideas for an early Beatles logo, and we see him scribbling around there with the letter B featuring antennae, insect antennae sticking out of the letter B. And also we discussed the very early Beatles logo that appeared on their drum skin back in the early 60s, in early 1963, and that was designed by Tex O'Hara. Okay, here's a passage from the book Maximum Volume, The Life of Beatles producer George Martin. It's a 2-volume book, and from volume 1 there's a piece in there where they're discussing the release of and the making of the Beatles' first album from 1963, Please Please Me. Now, before it was given that title, there were some discussions about the title and what to call it, and there was also discussions and ideas being thrown around about possible covers, ideas for the front cover. And from the book, it states that McCartney suggested for the title of the album Off the Beatle Track, also providing a rudimentary cover design that featured the four Beatles along with two insect antennae poking out from the B in Beatles. In an effort to bring McCartney's idea to fruition, George Martin came up with a clever cover idea of his own. As a fellow of the Zoological Society of London, he had made regular trips to the zoo. Rather stupidly, George later recalled, I thought it would be great to have the Beatles photographed outside the insect house, but the zoo people were very stuffy indeed, so the idea fell down. And let's fast forward a few decades to an album that Andrew and I also mentioned, Paul McCartney's Egypt Station album. And just a few days before the release of the Egypt Station album, ahead of its release, in a bid to promote the album, on McCartney's Twitter page, a series of symbols were being posted daily, 16 in total, to be exact, one for each track on this album. And here's a few of those images. This is the image for the track Caesar Rock. This is for Station 2. And finally for the track Confidant, what do we have here? It's a Beatle, of course, along with the pyramid. What's most striking, of course, is that it's making reference specifically to the scarab, not merely as an insect, but as the ancients regarded it, the sun god. Don't you think? Now, I might be wrong about this, but I'm under the assumption that if one is knighted by the Queen of England, what happens is you're given a coat of arms. Paul McCartney and Beatles producer George Martin were both knighted in the late 1990s. And here's George Martin's coat of arms as awarded to him in 2004. And if you take a look there, you have three Beatles on there. Three Beatles as in the insect, the Beatles. Now, there are some within the P.I.D community who've looked at this and, assuming of course that the reason that George Martin has put those Beatles on there is because it's some kind of reference to his history with the band The Beatles, his history with having worked with the band The Beatles. Assuming that that is the case, there are those within the P.I.D community who've wondered why it is that instead of putting four Beatles on there, on the coat of arms, he's put three. And it's been suggested that perhaps the reason that George Martin has done that is because what he's doing subliminally is telling us that actually there are only three Beatles that he was working with from 1966 onwards, that one of the Beatles, i.e. Paul, was dead. Okay. And you might not recognise this, you might not notice it, but that's Paul McCartney's coat of arms, and apparently that is the insect, the beetle. That represents the insect, the beetle. There's a website called thebeatlesbible.com. It's a good website, actually. It's got some really good information on there, actually. And according to thebeatlesbible.com, the shield that you see there, featuring two black curved emblems, is divided in two, and the resulting four shapes resemble Beatles' backs. They symbolise McCartney and his fellow Beatles. And additionally, according to the Heraldry Society, no less, on its website, it describes this coat of arms as the four bits of beetle back made by the flaunches, representing the four Beatles, as in the band. So there you go. Of his own volition, it appears, McCartney, through the imagery of his coat of arms, has aligned the McCartney family name in a most permanent fashion to the insect, the beetle, and he's also aligned it to the Beatles, as in the band. Okay, here's Andrew. Interesting stuff.
Some marvelous research, man. And I think we could go on for quite a while about
We could,
this.
but I think we'll wrap it up soon. Yeah.
We should continue. We should definitely do this again sometime in the future. I thank you again for inviting me on this wonderful show and your work. I'm a big admirer of it.
Thank you very much. And I'll close this off just with one quote taken from an interview that Lennon gave in 1980, just shortly before his death. He says, and this is with regards to the Beatles, his career with the Beatles and what the Beatles were about. I'm sure you probably read this quote before. It's featured in the book, David Sheff's book, All We Are Saying. And David Sheff was one of the last, and this is actually taken from David Sheff's interview with Lennon, one of the last interviews for Playboy magazine. And this is what Lennon said. He said, "What's this game of doing things because other people want it? The whole Beatle idea was to do what you want, right? To take your own responsibility. Do what you want and try not to harm other people, right? Do what thou willst, as long as it doesn't hurt somebody." So there you go. What did Crowley say? Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So straight from the Beatles' mouth, as it were.
Well, that's a direct quote. I mean, you can't get more precise than that.
Yeah.
But
well, listen, thank
stuff.
you very, very, very much for dedicating so much of your time today. Is there any internet links you'd like to direct us to that people might want to go and take a look at some more of your work or listen to?
Yeah, well, I think everything I've got, writing, some links to some film work, and I do play some music as well. And I think you could find it all on AndrewArnett.me. And but there'll be a lot more things I'm working on in the future, and you'll hear about those things to come as they come along.
And that's Arnett with 2 T's on the end as well.
Yes, AndrewArnett.me, 2 T's, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure, and thanks so much for allowing me to take up so much of your day. My goodness.
Well, the pleasure is mine, and hopefully we can do this again sometimes in the near future.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks a lot. And there you go, me in conversation with Andrew Arnett, as recorded in January 2022. Before I shoot off, I'll just plug some of my websites in case you're interested to take a deeper dive into some of my stuff. You have the Occult Beatles. You can find that at the occultbeatles.wordpress.com. There's also my site Conspiro Media, which was launched in 2011, and since 2016 it's been mainly focused on the occult and conspiratorial aspects connected to the so-called 60s counterculture of London. There's also my Conspiro Media Facebook page, and there you'll find basically a compilation, if you like, of material from the Occult Beatles and Conspiro Media, and some bonus stuff as well. And you can find that at facebook.com/Conspiro Media. That's facebook.com/Conspiro Media. There's also my YouTube page, ConspiroTV, all one word, and my Spreaker page, which you can find at Spreaker.com/user/Matt Conspiro. That's Spreaker.com/user/Matt Conspiro. And yes, there you go. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot for listening. And until the next time from me, bye-bye.